Hello guys, welcome to another video. And in this one I'm going to be covering some more of the ascendancies for the upcoming Path of Exile 1 event, the Legacy of Phrecia. And we've received another 3 new ascendancies there, and in this video I'm going to be covering 2 of them. That's the Daughter of Oshabi and the Surfcaster. So let's begin with the Daughter of Oshabi, which is a Ranger ascendancy. And this ascendancy has a few interesting themes going on. There's some wand things here, wand attacks. There's some inspiration coming in here from the Oath of the Magi. That, of course, was an Affliction ascendancy, a Wildwood ascendancy. And we also have some evasion stacking things here. And there's a poison node and some shrine stuff as well. So let's begin first with the wand branch over here. So first we have Illuminating Wisps, which is +2 to maximum number of Sacred Wisps and +2 to the number of Sacred Wisps summoned. So Sacred Wisps are something to do specifically with the Sacred Wisp support, which is a gem that kind of goes on for attack skills that use wands. And how this works is, whenever you attack, you essentially summon one of these wisps. They don't really have like a short duration or something, so once you actually have them up, they're always going to be there pretty much as long as you're spamming the skill. And each wisp has a chance to actually reuse your attack that you are using with this skill. And whenever they do actually trigger that attack, it deals a bit less damage. So it's essentially like a multiplier on top of using the same attack again. Normally, you would have a maximum of 2 summoned Sacred Wisps, and whenever you're attacking sort of trash monsters, you know, white-blue monsters, you will have a 25% chance for each of those wisps to actually trigger the attack. And whenever you're actually in the presence of a rare or unique enemy, so whenever you actually need more damage, you'll then have an extra 25% chance. So when you actually need the damage, when you're fighting a boss or something like that, you will be having 50% chance on each of these wisps to actually re-trigger that attack. And on a level 21 gem, whenever they actually trigger the attack, they'll be dealing 50% less damage. So with those numbers, on average across many attacks, each of these wisps is the equivalent to about 25% more damage when you have a rare or unique enemy in your presence. And so with this support alone, you'll be dealing about 50% more damage with both of the wisps up against a rare or unique enemy. So this node here is going to double the amount of Sacred Wisps. It's going to bring the maximum up to 4. And when you have those 4 wisps up, you'll be going from dealing, 150% of the damage to 200% of the damage, or an effective 33% more damage from this node. So that is a very good damage node there immediately for wands, for a wand attack build. And that immediately creates some options there that you can do scaling wand attacks. Obviously, you're in the ranger section of the tree, so there's a lot of projectile-based things there. And coming off of Illuminating Wisps, there is Spell Slinging. Now, I actually would have preferred if this node was a standalone node, because they kind of don't really go that well together. Illuminating Wisps, of course, is going to be amplifying the damage that you're doing with the attack, whereas Spell Slinger, or Spell Slinging, is buffing up Spell Slinger, and you're going to be spamming off a spell there whenever you actually use the skill. But the thing is with Spell Slinger is that you can see here that it triggers supported spells when you fire projectiles from a non-triggered wand attack. So the wisps actually triggering your attack will not be triggering Spell Slinger unless there's some kind of bugged interaction going on. But as far as I can tell, these two don't interact that well with each other unless you're using Spell Slinger specifically for some utility-based things, in which case this will actually go quite nicely together. Then you can actually use Spell Slinger with a reduced cost, so you don't have to spend as much mana reserving it, and it will also mean that it will fire off those spells a lot more regularly with that 50% increased cooldown recovery rate. So for Spell Slinger, this skill will reserve 25% of your mana for each skill that it can trigger that's linked to it. But one of the interesting things with Spell Slinger that was changed in the not too distant past, back in a past patch, I think it was, here we go, 3.19. So Spell Slinger, the added damage that is obtained from your wand that is then added to the spell was increased quite substantially. So it used to be 100% at level 20 and it's now 174%. And you also gained a bit of a buff there 2 patches back, where the quality also adds extra damage from the equipped wand. So on a level 20 gem, you'll be gaining 174% of the damage of the equipped wand that is added as spell damage to that triggered spell. And one of the really interesting things that you can look at doing here with Spellslinger is you can make use of Pragmatism, which is a unique body armor. It comes from the King in the Mist. And how this body armor works is it gives you a huge bunch of gem levels there, plus 12 to the level of socketed skill gems, and you get minus 2 to the level of socketed skill gem per socketed gem. So the more and more gems you socket, the less benefit you get from the body armor. Ideally, you want to be using, just a handful of gems in there. And one of the things you can do is you can socket Spellslinger in here, because Spellslinger counts as both a skill gem and a support gem, right? It has the Spellslinger function and the Spellslinger support. And that means that it actually gains those gem levels. And you can see here on the gem level scaling, if you're able to put Spellslinger into your body armor and link it with just one spell there that you're triggering, you'll probably be able to get around a level 30 Spellslinger after you get some other gem level scaling as well. And that will mean that you'll be gaining 234% added damage from your wand. And obviously the less damage of those trigger spells is also going down there. And the cooldown recovery rate is scaling massively as well, going from 38% on a level 20 gem all the way up to 58% there, and you're also going to be getting the 50% coming in from spell slinging. So obviously you're going to have to look at breakpoints there in terms of cooldowns and how often you're actually able to trigger it, but that is something you could do with Pragmatism, which is quite interesting in terms of that node there. You would then kind of look for a spell that has a good damage effectiveness that you could make use of, with the added damage coming in from the wand from the Spellslinger support. Overall, I do kind of like this node here, the Spellslinging node, but I do think that it would be nicer if it was a standalone node that was coming off of the starting point. And one other thing to mention here is the skills supported by Spellslinger have 50% reduced mana reservation. This is actually different wording to what we normally have. It's usually, reduced mana reservation efficiency. So whether this is going to be a multiplier or if this is just poor wording, I'm not sure. There's actually a few cases of strange wording on these ascendancies. So perhaps by the time we actually get into the game, a lot of those wording things have been cleared up and it's not really a problem. Or perhaps this is going to be a different stat and it's a direct multiplier, it just halves whatever mana reservation the skill would have been. I'm not sure about that. Next up, let's take a look at the shrine buffs over here. So shrines, you click on them, you get a pretty strong buff that lasts for a duration. And the first node here is going to allow you to trigger level 20 create lesser shrine when you kill an enemy. Now that skill is already in the game, but it's a level 1 version and it's on the goal. Now this is actually quite a strong mapping item. As soon as you spec into shrines on the Atlas tree and you equip this item, you are pretty much god mode in maps, right? You always get a bunch of shrines, you get the lesser shrines as well, and you have a huge amount of increased shrine effect buff on you. And also the durations allow these shrine buffs to stack up on top of each other, and you're just empowered by sort of 4 or 5 shrine buffs all the time, and your character is super fast and does a whole bunch of damage. And is also very survivable as well. We don't know just yet if this spell is going to be the same as the one coming from the Ascendancy. We're not sure if level 20 is going to be any different to level 1, but I would assume it's probably going to be very similar, if not exactly the same. So one thing that you could consider doing there is actually combining this with the goal. Because these are 2 different skills, you have trigger level 1 and trigger level 20, that means that it should be triggering 2 different skills, and it should be triggering 2 different shrines than dropping, and obviously that does mean you're going to have to do a lot of clicking, so some people don't really like that too much. And in that case, you might not even want to interact with this shrine branch on the Ascendancy at all. But the goal is something that you might want to do even if you don't want to do a lot of clicking, because behind that Ascendancy node there is the Innate Blessing node, which is gain a random shrine buff every 10 seconds. Now, when I actually first saw this in the Settlers League, because this is actually an enchantment that comes from runesmithing to go on staves. And when I first saw this buff, I thought this was insanely strong, but it actually turns out that the gain a random shrine buff every 10 seconds is not the same. You don't gain the same duration of shrines as you would if you clicked a shrine in a map. So I can actually show you that here. If we scroll down here, we can actually see this. This is the staff enchantment here. Gain a random shrine buff every 10 seconds when this enchantment is actually equipped. The shrine buff that's granted only lasts for 10 seconds. So the buff duration is 10 seconds, but obviously that buff duration can be improved by any kind of shrine increased duration. which you do get a little bit there from the goal, you get 50%. But even with that, you're not going to be able to stack up a bunch of these shrines. So you're going to have the ones coming in automatically from this rotating buff here. You're going to have any of the small ones that you click. And of course, any that you actually click in the map will have a longer duration than this. And a lot of those, the same kind of shrines that are coming in from this one. So we can actually see some of the shrine buffs there. This is actually a little bit of research, a bit of data that came in from someone who was doing testing in terms of the weighting of which shrines actually spawn. And I assume that this modifier here is going to be exactly the same as the one on the Daughter of Oshabi. It's written exactly the same, so I think it's probably going to be identical. And so you can have a look here at what shrines are more likely to appear and which ones are very rare. So you can see here the Divine and Gloom Shrine are extremely rare. The Divine one is the one that actually makes you invulnerable, and the Gloom Shrine is the one that makes monsters explode and give you some extra damage. So you're barely ever going to see them. They are extremely rare from this particular modifier. Then you have the Brutal, Charged, and Echoing Shrine, which are also quite rare. So the Echoing Shrine is the one that makes skills repeat. The Brutal Shrine is some increased damage there. But you'll notice down here, you have a list of shrines that are very, very common. So these are the ones that you are most likely going to get whenever this 10 seconds ticks up. And in this selection here, we have Freezing and Lightning, which are two of the worst shrines that you can possibly get. That's the Ice Nova and the Shock Nova. However, there are some pretty good shrines in here, actually, in the more common ones. You have Impenetrable, Massive, Resistance, and Shrouded. Now, let's first discuss Shrouded, because even though this is typically one of the weaker shrines and it doesn't scale with shrine effect or anything like that, this ascendancy is going to be doing some evasion kind of spec, most likely, because it's sitting on that side of the tree and it has some other things that may make you want to invest quite heavily into evasion. So the Shrouded Shrine could be quite useful. It creates smoke clouds there, and the smoke clouds will make the enemies be blinded, and that will essentially make your evasion more efficient, make you able to evade a bit more there if you're not already evade capped. And then the other shrines there that are kind of very likely to spawn are the Impenetrable, Massive, and Resistance, all of which are very, very strong actually. So first of all, we have the Impenetrable Shrine, which is a huge amount of increased evasion rating. There's also armor and energy shield there, so if you're stacking any of those things and you have increased shrine effects, that is actually a huge modifier to your defenses. There's also the Resistance Shrine, which is common as well. That's 50% to all elemental resistances and plus 10% to all maximum. So with enough buff effect scaling there for your shrines, you'll be able to get that up to hitting 90% whenever you actually have that buff up. Then there's also the Massive Shrine there, which is a bunch of life and area effect as well, and some character size. This one, again, I mean, this is huge when you combine it with, you know, the effect scaling there from the goal. This is 75% increased effect of shrine buffs on you, which means that whenever you have that Massive Shrine, you're going to be having 70% increased maximum life and 70% increased area effect, which is just really strong. At the same time, you're going to have, you know, 17% increased maximum resistances. And this is all resistances, not just elemental. You'll notice that this is elemental, but this one's all, so this includes chaos as well. Some very strong buffs there. And those are the ones that are most likely to be up a lot of the time. They're going to have high uptime because they are the highest weighted. And on top of that, you also, of course, have those lesser shrines as well, so you could potentially get a lot of these. The lesser shrines themselves actually last a little bit longer, so instead of lasting 10 seconds, they last 20 seconds by default. And that means that with the goal, they're going to last 30 seconds. So you're going to be able to stack up quite a few of those if you're using the goal and Woodland Shrines combo, where you should, in theory, be able to summon two lesser shrines with separate cooldowns because they're two different skills. Alright, moving on to Roots of the Grove, which is very similar to the Eater of Worlds boots, Inextricable Fate, but they are slightly different there. So you have all damage inflicts poison against enemies affected by at least 5 Grasping Vines, and you also have inflict 1 Grasping Vine on hit. So this is going to be really strong for any build that's able to hit very fast and specs into poison. Going to be able to very quickly stack up Grasping Vines on enemies, and as soon as you reach that 5 cap there, you're going to be able to immediately start inflicting poison. One of the biggest downsides of Inextricable Fate is that those boots are very awkward for mapping. They've always been extremely good for bossing, because as soon as the boss stops, and most bosses are stationary a lot of the time, they immediately start stacking up those grasping vine stacks, and then they are very quickly able to be inflicted with poison from all of your damage that you're dealing. Whereas this one is going to allow you to be a little bit more in control in terms of mapping, because you're able to deal the damage and then apply the poisons based on those hits that you're throwing out, rather than based on what the monster is doing. But this is still a very, very strong node. Any build that's able to poison with all damage can break a lot of mechanics in the game and just do some ridiculous things. You can go for elemental overload, for example, and go for a elemental poison build, which is very strong. And then we have this branch over here, which is kind of a little bit evasion stacking themed, and you also have some things going on there with the Oath of the Magi, which of course was an ascendancy in Affliction from the Wildwood. So we have Oath of the Magi first, which is the first node coming off here, and there's 4 different modifiers here. So defenses from equipped body armor are doubled if it has no socketed gems, plus 60% to all elemental resistances if you have an equipped helmet with no socketed gems, 30% increased maximum life if you have equipped gloves with no socketed gems, and 30% increased movement speed if you have equipped boots with no socketed gems. So this is already a really nice node for 1 point coming off the start, because this is incredible for leveling. As soon as you grab this and you're able to equip a helmet and boots with no socketed gems, you're going to absolutely breeze through the campaign from that point onwards. Absolutely no problem, because you have 30% increased movement speed. Your resistances are pretty much solved for the most part with, plus 60%. That is absolutely incredible. And you're just going to be really strong all the way through the campaign and don't have to worry too much about gear progression, because these buffs are just so powerful at that early stage of the game. Now, there's also this defenses from equipped body armor are doubled if it has no socketed gems, and there's a big angle here with evasion stacking, and that's because of this second node that comes off of it, forest tracking. So forest tracking is 2% increase attack damage per 450 evasion rating, and you also get that bonus there with the Oath of the Magi, which was the rare and unique enemies appearing on the minimap, which is actually really nice. This is a nice bit of quality of life here, but the reason why you're speccing into forest tracking is for the increased attack damage per 450 evasion rating, and there's the potential there to do an extreme evasion stacking build, where you essentially go for a large amount of evasion on your body armor. I believe a well-crafted body armor can get to around 5,000 to 6,000. At the very top end, you could possibly reach 6,500 evasion at the very top end with everything. That would be, a 30% quality syndicate garb, along with the heist enchantment as well for increased defense modifier magnitude. All of that stuff, you would probably be able to get around 6,500 maybe. But with that said, 5,000 evasion should be pretty easily obtainable. That would be around triple tier 2 evasion modifiers on a chest piece with 20% quality, and I think that should be fairly easily obtainable through fossil crafting, and that would be a strong basis for an evasion stacking build, as with no socketed gems you would be immediately gaining 10,000 flat evasion from that, and then of course you want to be scaling that with all of the modifiers on the passive tree and modifier on grace for more evasion and things like that. And I think you should be able to reach 100 or 150,000 evasion rating with a moderate amount of investment, and that would mean that this node here, forest tracking, will be providing you 400 to 600%-ish increased attack damage from the evasion scaling. And of course, you could consider using that with Dream Feather, which is a sword there, one-handed sword, which already scales with evasion rating, even provides you a little bit of flat evasion rating, and grants you the same modifier on the node, on the forest tracking node there, but it's a little bit weaker, so it's half effectiveness there, 1% increase attack damage per 450 evasion rating. But I think you're much less likely to want to use Dream Feather in the Daughter of Oshabi build, because you'd much rather use a really strong weapon to begin with, because that's kind of the problem with Dream Feather, is that it's not a very strong weapon, whereas because you're already getting your increased attack damage scaling from the ascendancy, you can then go for a really strong base weapon, and that means that you're able to invest a lot more aggressively on the passive tree into things like evasion and, increased attack speed and stuff like that, because all of the increased damage on the passive tree becomes a lot weaker in comparison, because you already have a huge amount of it coming in from the ascendancy. So that is definitely an angle there. You could do an evasion stacking build. Now, one other thing that I want to mention on this ascendancy, which is something that people may have overlooked, is a life stacking angle. Because the Oath of the Magi there already has 30% increased maximum life if you have equipped gloves with no socketed gems. So that's a large chunk of increased maximum life there. And then, of course, I already talked about the massive amount of increased maximum life you can get from shrine buffs. Just the massive shrine alone from this one here, along with the goal, would provide you with 70% increased maximum life. And of course, you have the lesser maximum shrine there as well. You could even consider using Blunderball, which already provides you with a lesser massive shrine. And you also get the increased buff effect there as well. So that is a ton of maximum life scaling. And of course, if you're going for that kind of route, you would be using the Untouched Soul, which is a unique amulet that drops from the King in the Mist. It's actually a very common drop from him. And this one provides you with 40 to maximum life for each empty red socket on any equipped item. Now, that is extremely powerful in terms of this ascendancy, because you're already wanting to have a bunch of items here, maybe 2 of your items, or maybe a lot more than that if you're going for a full life stacking build with empty sockets. So if you were to do that, obviously this is a ranger ascendancy, so you, being a life stacking build, you would likely want to path over to the left side of the passive tree, down on the bottom towards the Marauder start, and that would mean that you would then be able to freely use armor gear, which can naturally get red sockets very easily. That means you can have a bunch of empty red sockets on your gear to be able to stack up a bunch of max life, in combination with this max life scaling here. And you could also go for Blood Magic for 10% more maximum life. There's also the Mastery there for 10% more maximum life on the Life Mastery wheels. And of course, if you really wanted to, you could even go Dissolution of the Flesh for up to 30% more maximum life. So there's just kind of big life stacking angle coming in here on this ascendancy. Alright, so that is the Daughter of Oshabi. Pretty interesting ascendancy there. And up next we have the Surfcaster, which is another Shadow Ascendancy. We already saw the Arakali Ascendancy, and now we've got the Surfcaster. This is probably the strongest Ascendancy we're seeing so far in this event, and it just looks absolutely crazy. So let's begin straight away with these nodes over here. We have Screaming Reels and Bated Breath. So 50% more cast speed while holding a fishing rod. And all hits are critical strikes while holding a fishing rod. Some of you may be asking, what the hell is a fishing rod? Because most people, I would wager that most people that have played Path of Exile have never found a fishing rod, and they've maybe found a divination card that talks about a fishing rod, but perhaps they've never actually seen one. And so a fishing rod is a melee weapon. It's a two-handed melee weapon, and it is a very, very rare weapon. And that's because the only way you can actually drop a fishing rod is by having the Fairgrave's Tricorn equipped. So when you actually have this unique helmet equipped, the fishing rod is then actually enabled as a possible drop whenever you kill monsters. And I mean, this item is just part of the whole like fishing meme, the mini game. Does it exist? Who knows? By using a fishing rod, of course, you are severely limiting what you're able to use as your kind of offensive scaling in the build, because most of the damage usually comes from your main hand weapon and even your offhand, if it's like a caster shield, for example. Or if you're using a two-handed weapon, then you're gaining most of the damage from that two-handed weapon. But for a fishing rod, that's not going to be the case. You can see fishing rods basically have no good mods that you can put on them. You could potentially add a beast craft for an aspect skill, and one of the only real notable things there is that you can get increased cast speed on it, which is something, I suppose. And if you're able to get extremely lucky and actually get a unique fishing rod, you can get Reef Bane here, which is up to 40% increased cast speed, so a little bit better there. And you can get a few nice implicit modifiers on there on the corrupted implicits. There's actually some divination cards here which drop fishing rods. So you have the Old Man, which is a divination card that drops a rare fishing rod. It's already corrupted with 2 implicits, and you can actually get increased cast speed implicit on a fishing rod as well. Or you can get the Catch, which is another divination card there. That one drops a fishing rod that can then be crafted, but as I mentioned, you kind of only really want the cast speed there on a fishing rod. And I gotta say, I just love this. Like, this is just such a cool thing that they've done here. So you get to, use a fishing rod. It's completely ridiculous, but you get these incredibly powerful buffs here as a result. So 50% more cast speed, and all hits are critical strikes while holding a fishing rod. Now that immediately made me think of Detonate Dead of Chain Reaction, because that skill is actually really powerful. Obviously it got nerfed in a recent patch where you can no longer explode Spectre corpses, but even on its own it kind of scales very well in terms of, you know, doing maps, because obviously monsters get more and more life in each map, and that's kind of naturally scaling. But the thing about Detonate Dead or any kind of corpse explosion skill is that the critical strike chance is incredibly hard to scale. It's not affected by any kind of modifiers to spell critical strike chance, because the part of the ability that actually explodes the corpse is not considered to be a spell. It doesn't scale with any kind of spell damage or anything like that. Only this part of the skill scales with all of those spell modifiers. So being able to scale critical strikes for exploding corpses is extremely hard, and this ascendancy essentially just says that all of those hits are going to be critical strikes, so you don't even have to invest into any kind of crit scaling. And that means that you could do something like, for example, scaling up Unearth and using that as the catalyst there to make corpses that you then explode. And something else you could look into is the Maraline's Fallacy Amulet, because even though it provides 40% less critical strike chance, this doesn't matter at all, because all of your hits are guaranteed to be critical strikes, so you just simply benefit from that giant global critical strike multiplier. So that's the interesting thing to look out there. There's some other things you could do with this fishing rod line here. For example, Herald of Thunder, that has no base crit, so that would be really strong as well. And there's also Impulsors, which we'll talk about in a moment, but of course the explosion from Impulsor also has no base crit, and if you're able to combine that there, you'd have these exploding corpses that are also dealing critical damage, so they'll be exploding for a ton of damage, and you'll probably have a really nice mapper. Now, one of the other nodes we have here is Sea Legs, and this is actually a pretty strong node. It has the increased evasion from overcapped cold resistance there. That's a breach modifier. And there's also the critical strike chance increased by overcapped lightning resistance, and you get some res there. Now, this is actually kind of crazy considering this is an ascendancy node and you don't have to use your gear to actually obtain this evasion rating modifier. And even though this is a shadow ascendancy, I wouldn't be surprised to see some people doing some shenanigans with this ascendancy where they path all the way down to the bottom of the tree and they go for an armor stacking Surfcaster, because, you know, being able to go crazy on the cold resistance and scaling up your evasion like crazy to then convert it into armor is definitely something you could consider doing there, and that could be really powerful. Next up, we have the Ghost of the Deep, and this node is absolutely wild. This is even better than the previous node we talked about on the other ascendancy, which provides you a really nice, comfortable early game experience when you take the first lab. This is just even better than that. As soon as you ascend, you can grab Ghost of the Deep as your first notable, and this just makes you have 20% increased damage, 30% increased attack speed, 30% increased cast speed, and 30% increased movement speed. That is just the best quality of life you could ever ask for on an ascendancy node from the first lab. That is incredible. You probably won't even spec out of this one, to be honest with you, because unlike the other one on the other ascendancy there, where you have to have these kind of prerequisites of having your sockets empty to actually obtain those buffs, this one you just get it all the time. So you always have these buffs up here, and that is just going to be so powerful for almost every build. Really nice one there on Ghost of the Deep. This is immediately making this ascendancy extremely nice as the League starter choice, and that's going to be really good there. Now, for the other half of the ascendancy, they all branch off of this one node. So you have one node that comes off of the starting location, then you have another 4 nodes that all branch off of it. And the interesting thing about this branch over on this side of the tree is that it's kind of a bunch of unique rings that they've rolled into a bunch of ascendancy nodes. There's also some other uniques there as well, which we'll discuss in a moment. But first of all, you have Stormy Seas, which is 100% of lightning damage converted to cold damage, and your cold damage can shock. Now, this is essentially just a better version of Call of the Brotherhood. Usually you'd have to stack up 2 of these rings, and you'd have to use the catalyst there as well. And even then, you wouldn't reach 100% of lightning damage converted to cold damage. You still have a little bit of lightning damage remaining. And this one is going to convert all 100%. And also, it makes it so your cold damage can shock, not just that you shock against frozen enemies. So this is just even better than that as well. It just means that you're going to be able to inflict shock without having to freeze. And this ascendancy node on its own is already better than wearing 2 Call of the Brotherhoods. And that means that both of your ring slots are free, And that's important because ring slots are super powerful, and a lot of these modifiers you'll notice here on this ascendancy are all coming from unique rings that are typically considered to be quite good on their own, but if you're able to get them from ascendancy and free up your ring slot, that makes them extremely powerful. So for example, here we have Glacial Wave, which is enemies chilled by your hits lessen their damage dealt by half of chill effect, and enemies chilled by your hits have damage taken increased by chill effect. So that second one there, the damage taken increased by chill effect, that one is pretty good. It could be up to 30% increased damage taken on the monsters, but since you already have shock, it's not quite as good as it first appears, but it is still pretty good. The first node there, though, is very strong. If you have a 30% chill, that's going to be 15% less damage dealt by those monsters, so that's quite a good defensive setup. And this, of course, is the modifiers that you usually get from the Call of the Void ring. This ring is very, very good, but since you're getting it from an ascendancy, once again, it means that you can get a much stronger crafted ring and use that instead. But one of the things you'll notice there that the Glacial Wave node doesn't have, that the Call of the Void does have, which is the all damage from hits can chill you. And that is because that's on another node here. So down here we've got Changing Seasons, and all damage taken from hits can chill you, and the effect of chill on you is reversed. So this is absurdly strong, super, super strong node. It's basically Winterweave, but it's better than Winterweave in every way. Like, if you look at this ring, this is a pretty weak ring overall. The effect of chill on you is reversed is basically the only really, really good mod on here. Everything else is just kind of a bit mediocre. You know, you have like 1/3 of the life you could get on a good ring. You have some cold res there. This is not particularly great base as a coral ring. And so you can have a really strong crafted ring and you can still gain this reverse chill modifier. And you also have the all damage taken from hits can chill you line on this node. So you can just spec into this one node here and you can do the reverse chill shenanigans. And then you can set up, for example, a, Forbidden Rite setup where you have like a trigger wand or a trigger craft on your weapon, and that way you can actually trigger Forbidden Rite, which then deals damage to you and inflicts chill on you, which is reversed. So you have a bunch of increased action speed based on the amount of damage that actually deals to you. So down here you have a bunch of unique ring modifiers rolled into the Ascendancy, which is really, really strong. And up here on the other half of this branch is some more kind of utility-based things you have within the Tempest, which is enemies you kill are shocked, and shocks you inflict spread to other enemies within 1.5 meters. So this is the Storm's Gift Glove, so this is the modifiers that come on that. And this means, once again, we'll go back to that Impulsor setup where you can actually use this in combination with Impulsor to have these huge chain shock explosions where they just chain from one to the other. And that is really, really nice there. But again, on this Ascendancy, because there's so many strong options, I actually think that these two up here are probably the least likely options that people are going to be choosing in their Ascendancy. There's also the Brine-bound one there, which is 50% chance to freeze enemies for 1 second when they hit you, and enemies you freeze remain frozen for at least 1 second. So there's some shenanigans you can do there with Ice Tomb, which is a unique body armor there. This also provides 20% chance to freeze enemies for 1 second when they hit you, which is the same modifier. So this will stack additively and provide 70% chance with that node. And then, of course, whenever that actually happens, you always freeze them for 1 second. So you could do some shenanigans there where you combine it with the Halcyon Amulet, which then spreads those freezes within a radius of 1.5 meters. So you could have this thing where you're walking through maps and whenever a monster just hits you, the entire pack of monsters just get frozen as a result, which could be quite fun, but basically a bit of a meme setup there. But overall, this Ascendancy just looks kind of crazy. Like, this just looks really, really strong. I think there's a bunch of stuff you can do with this, and there's actually so many different avenues you could go down with this Ascendancy. There's so many different things you could do. I wouldn't recommend, if you're planning to go for the fishing rod things, I wouldn't recommend doing that for a league starter. I think you should probably have a setup where you want to go for Ghost of the Deep early and do something else early on the Ascendancy to then be able to farm for the fishing rod setup, because getting a fishing rod early on might be a bit problematic. You can get the Fairgraves Tricorn very early, and if you are looking to go down this route, what I recommend is, play Trade League, buy a Fairgraves Tricorn as soon as you can, and equip this item straight away, giving you the best possible chance to actually find a fishing rod. And then as soon as you actually get the fishing rod, you could consider then transitioning over. It really depends on what kind of build you're going for. But yes, that is those two Ascendancies, the Surfcaster and the Daughter of Oshabi. I will be covering the other ascendancy that was revealed, but I'll save that for another video because this video has already gone too long. That's the Antiquarian, I think, which is a Marauder ascendancy. Very cool ascendancy, very weird ascendancy. So I'll be covering that in another video. But what do you guys think of these two ascendancies? Are you planning to perhaps league start one of these in the Legacy of Phrecia event? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.